Hi, so for this screencast, I will be looking at Choice 2, which is the state of the U.S. education in 2015. It states that the South and West seem like a great place to live because of the nice weather. But how do the regions compare in things like average teacher salaries or student per teacher ratio? First, I will look at the first question, which states, based on the average teacher salaries for states in the South and the West, where would you prefer to teach and why? So I have now launched the data for the U.S. education in 2015 in CodeApp. I'm going to use this graph that was already inputted to drag the average salary to the x-axis. Now it shows the average salary for all of the places from the data, which are 51 different places. Now I'm going to separate it based on the region. Because the question asks to look at the South and the West, I would like to hide the points for Northeast and Midwest, since that is not something we are concerned with. Now that I just have the average salary plotted for the South and West schools, I'm going to add on top a box plot, mean, and median. Now I can see the box plots which show the average salary, but it looks to me that the South has some points that may be considered outliers. So using CodeApp, I'll ask them to show me the outliers. Because I want to look at it without the outliers, I want to see where these outliers are. So it looks like they are in Maryland, and then this outlier is in Mississippi. So I'm going to go ahead and hide these outlier points and see how that affects my mean and median. Now you can see the mean and median go rather close to each other when before they were pretty far off due to the outliers. It doesn't appear that there are any outliers for the West region though, so I will keep all those points visible. I would say if I was just looking at the average salary for these different regions, that I would pick the West schools. I would pick these schools because you can see the mean is about $53,646, whereas the mean for South schools are $48,227. Obviously, the mean in the West is higher than the mean in the South, and due to that, I would pick the West to teach just based solely off of average salary. This conclusion was made solely based on looking at the average salary, but when selecting a place to live or to teach in, you may want to take in other things into consideration. So as you can see, this data set shows many different variables that you might want to think about, and in the next question I will address. Now that I've already selected the West for the place that I would prefer to teach based on average teacher salaries, I will explore question 2. Question 2 says, explore other quantitative attributes in this dataset and compare the distributions for the South and the West. So again, I will probably hide those other regions that are not South or West. Based on the data you have examined, in which region do states seem to have good teaching conditions in their school? So first I have to think about what attributes I would want to look for in a school. So I'm going to look at what the data set gives me. It gives me expenditure per student, which is the average amount of money spent per student, average salary, which we just looked into, number of teachers in the state, number of high school graduates, the average revenue per student, the number of students per one teacher, as well as the geospatial state boundary data needed for that. One thing that I would find important is the student-to-teacher ratio in a classroom. So I'm going to look into that quantitative value. So I will add in a new graph and drag student-teacher to the x-axis, and again drag the region to the y-axis. I'm going to once again hide the Northeast and Midwest data points since we are only interested in the South and the West states. Looking at this without adding in a box plot, I can see that the West has a very spread out number of students per teacher, whereas the South seems to be pretty clustered around the same number. So I'm going to go ahead and add in that box plot as well as the mean and the median to see what happens. I'm going to also select the outliers just to see if there are any from Code Output. So as you can see here, it's obvious that the West has a higher students per teacher than the South. So that's something to take into consideration because you don't want to have too many students in your classroom and be overwhelmed. So it looks like there are two outliers, so I'm going to go ahead and hide those and see how that affects my mean and median. So it seems to go up a little, but as you can see, the mean number of students per teacher is 15.41, and the mean is 17.67 students per teacher in the West. So based on that, I think I would select the South states just because it would be nicer to have a smaller classroom than to have a higher average salary. Something that might also affect the quality of the school that you teach at is the expenditure per student, which is the amount of money spent per student. So since this graph that I created for the last thing I looked at already has just the South and the West data points, I'm going to go ahead and drag this to the y-axis to compare students per teacher with expenditure. So as you can see, it looks like there is some correlation between the number of students in one classroom to the expenditure per student. It seems to look like there is a negative correlation, meaning the fewer the students per classroom, the higher the expenditure is. So the less students in one class, the more money that is spent on students. I'm going to go ahead and add in a least squares line to see what our R-squared value is. So our R-squared value is 0.126. With that R-squared value, you can find the value of R, or the correlation coefficient, which is 0 and 355 thousandths. This number tells me that there is some correlation, but it is not very strong and it's lower to moderate. So as you can see, these points are pretty spread out from the line and not a lot are very close except for these right here. So that makes me think that there's not that strong of a correlation, but there is still something there. Now that I've compared students per teacher and expenditure per student to one another, I want to just look at expenditure per student in relation to the region they are in. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I already put expenditure on my x-axis. So I'm going to remove my y, and I'm going to add my region back in so I can compare these two. So I want to see which region has on average a higher expenditure per student, because that school is more likely to be better for your students and hopefully better for the teacher as well. So I'm going to add in my mean, and I'm going to add in my box plot and show my outputs. So it looks like they're actually pretty close to one another. This mean is 10,846 for the West, and the mean for the South is 10,066. Seems like there are a couple outliers, so I'm interested to see where those lie. So highlighting these, it also highlights them in my map as well as in my data set. So it seems like they are in West Virginia. Those outliers are in West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. So all clustered around the same area. These outliers are in Alaska and Wyoming. Alaska has been an outlier a couple of times now, so that might be a school area that needs more teachers, which is why they tend to lean on the high side of things. Going back to the original question, I would conclude that I would want to teach in the South, because even though the West did have a higher average teacher salary, the South had a lower student to teacher ratio, which would lead me to believe I would have better teaching conditions and more chances to get to know my students and build that rapport, which is super important when teaching. Thank you.